Hey, welcome to Outsmart Your Guitar. Glad you could join us. Today is a Geoff Talk, and we're going to talk about a topic that apparently is quite popular at the very moment, and that is the seizure of over 3,000 fake guitars coming from Asia just before Thanksgiving of 2024. So let's get right to it, and be sure to like and subscribe to Outsmart Your Guitar along the way. So, as I just mentioned, over 3,000 guitars were just seized prior to Thanksgiving in 2024, and it included a whole lot of Gibson guitars, Gretsch and Fender, and PRS. Every one of them was a knockoff, not the genuine article. So, this is a very interesting thing because a lot of guitars have gotten into America by various means, through people buying them from overseas accounts, to them actually managing to get them smuggled into America right under the nose of customs. And they're in the marketplace here in America, and you need to be aware of it, because your money is precious. And a real Gibson, let's be honest, we'll just talk about Les Pauls right now. The Les Paul Studio is running for around $1,200 to $1,300 street price, maybe a little bit less. A standard Les Paul is running for around $3,000. A Les Paul Custom around $4,000. Any reissues are running from $4,000 to $7,000 and above, depending on whether it's a custom shop model or a signature model. Let's be honest. Real Les Pauls cost money. So if you're looking at a Les Paul that somebody's trying to sell for around $300 to $500, you might want to investigate whether it's real or not. And so I'm here to help you understand the reality of real or fake. Okay? So one of the cool things is I've got an image here, and let me put that up. Here's the haul that was just caught. 3,000 guitars. You can see you've got a Fender, what is that? A Jazzmaster on the far left, some 335 variant, a whole host of Les Pauls, including the Zakk Wylde one right there in the middle. And way over on the right, it looks like a 56 reissue is being shown as well. So the cross-section of Gibsons and some Fenders, as it turns out, are being built and passed off as legitimate guitars. Let's see, I've got another one here. Here's another close-up. You can see the Zakk Wylde guitar with the big concentric black and white circles. Lots of other Les Pauls. You see a custom over there on the right, a 3-pickup version. One weird white burst that I've never seen Gibson produce. And right behind that, you see what appears to be a 56 reissue. And then on the far left, it's blurry. It looks like it's one of those Corvette custom car themed jobs. So you can see we got some interesting stuff going on here. And here you can see on the left a Gretsch 6120, what looks like I don't know what that is in the middle there, some kind of SG sort of thing. And then on the right, a Paul Reed Smith. And then we see the EDS 1275, I think that's the model number, of the double neck Gibson SG that was made so famous by Jimmy Page, John McLaughlin, and various other folks. And so you can see quite a haul was taken. And all those boxes in the background, by the way, those are all other fake guitars. This is a warehouse full of over 3,000 guitars valued somewhere around $18 million. Now, that's assuming that they're being passed off as legitimate Gibsons, Gretsches, Fenders, and PRS guitars, and an attempt being made to sell them at US guitar prices. Otherwise, they're probably worth about, maybe a quarter of that at best if they're sold for $300 to $500, maybe $1,000, right? So, pretty interesting haul here by all these people. And you can see from a distance, some of them actually look pretty legitimate. That Gretsch looks legitimate, even though it's not really a Gretsch. And the PRS, yeah, I see issues with it that, this is not a PRS. But apart from that, the untrained eye will have trouble knowing the difference. Now, in case you are thinking, well, this is a rather recent phenomenon, isn't it? Really? I mean, since manufacturing was put overseas to Indonesia and China, that this fake Gibson thing, fake Fender thing, is really something new. Well, actually, I recently read an interview with Martin Barre, the former guitar player of Jethro Tull. He tells the story of around 1969, where a guy came to him with 3 guitars, a Les Paul Custom, a 52 Fender Telecaster, I think it was, and a refinished Les Paul that was now blonde, apparently. And he was really attracted to the refinished Les Paul. But the guy kept trying to put him over to one of the other 2, the Les Paul Custom or the Telecaster. Well, he chose the refinished Les Paul and played it for a number of years, actually, even after finding out, shortly after buying it, that he had indeed bought a fake Les Paul. This is back in 1969. There's another story I read in recent years about a Les Paul that's a Sunburst with the flame maple that actually isn't a Les Paul legitimately. It's a fake. And yet, believe it or not, that particular guitar is pretty famous and recently was valued at over $40,000 because it was so well made. There were still some things done that are indicative that it is not a Gibson, and yet it was passed off as such and sold as such a number of times until somebody apparently took it in to have it worked on, and the person working on it really understood and knew Gibsons and told the person, this is not a genuine Gibson guitar. And yet, because it was so well done, it is considered a valuable fake. And like I said, worth around $40,000 the last I heard, which was a few years back. So the idea of fake guitars, Gibsons and Fenders and whatnot, is nothing new, believe it or not. It actually goes back to the 60s that I've been able to tell. And so that I find is rather interesting. I thought you might like to know a little background about this fakery and how far back it actually goes, at least in my hearing. Now, I just want to clarify, I'm not talking about lawsuit guitars. Ibanez and a couple other companies whose names escape me right now were coming out with their take on the Les Paul and 2 Fender guitars, the Strat and the Tele, right? Gibson and Fender sent cease and desist orders to them after some of them showed up in America and were actually pretty decent guitars, particularly the Ibanez guitars. Ibanez had been really retooling and learning from previous experience how to actually put together a quality guitar. And we saw in the late 70s, they came out with their own guitars like the Artist, and then Yamaha came out with their SG 2000 and their SG 500 and their SG thousand guitars to compete with Les Pauls, and they were very good guitars. Takamine, back in 1971, started producing knockoffs of Martin D18s and D28s, which my friend and I, both of us guitar players playing in the same band, in 1971 went to our local music store where they had them in stock, and we played them, and they played fantastic and sounded amazing. And part of the story of how they got there was, as I understood it, was the engineers at Takamine bought a post-war Martin guitar and disassembled it to learn and understand how it was put together. I remember a long time ago when I first heard that, I was horrified that they would disassemble a guitar. They didn't destroy it, they just carefully took it apart so they could examine the structure and the construction techniques used so that they could then duplicate these processes to produce better quality instruments. Takamine was among the first to do this of Japanese guitar makers. And so their acoustic guitars from 71 forward started improving a lot. Yamaha also was putting out their versions of what were called Poor Man Martin, the FG series. They were actually very nice little guitars. The Red Label are now very sought after early 70s Yamahas because they actually sounded good for a plywood guitar, right? So I'm not talking about these guitars. I'm talking about actual, we're trying to pass this off as a Gibson, Fender, PRS, or Gretsch fake, right? Okay, just wanted to clarify. Now, part of the reason that I'm discussing this with you is I don't want you to spend money on a guitar that isn't the real deal. So for the sake of discussion here, I'm going to focus on Gibson and Les Paul in particular because this is the most duplicated counterfeit guitar out there. Gretsch's are a more recent phenomenon. Paul Reed Smith, too, are also a more recent phenomenon and not as plentiful. Fender, I haven't really seen a lot of fake Fenders running around being passed off as real Fenders, but it is happening. So just caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, right? So I'm going to deal with showing you some images of real versus fake. Okay, so we're going to do that right now. On screen, you see on the left the Chinese Gibson, laughingly called Chibson, Chinese Gibson, Chibson, and then on the right, the genuine article, Made in America, Gibson. Now, we'll work from the top down. So we're going to look at the open book top of the peg head. You'll notice how it's very curly, to use that term, on the Chinese version. On the genuine article, it's a more relaxed open book. You look at the logo itself, and the Chinese logo is flawed, to say the least. It's not lined up perfectly. If you look at the flow of the letters from lower left to upper right, at the bottom of the word Gibson, the B is not in line. Look at the bottom of the B on the actual Gibson. You'll see they're straight line, they're in line, like script should be. And you see it too on the top of the letters of Gibson, the I, the S, and the O, and the N, versus the I, the S, the O, and the N on the genuine article. They're very clean. It's a straight line. You're not wobbly. The dot on the I on the Chinese one is huge. And you see the dot on the I on the genuine article is actually rather small. Also, look at the distance between the book, the open book, and the first two pegs that you run into, the D and the G string peg heads, right? There's a huge distance between them and the open book. Whereas if you look on the genuine article, it's actually very tight. The Gibson is tucked in there, the logo is tucked in there. in between them. So there's only enough room for the Gibson logo before you hit the peg heads, right? And let's look at the tuners, the machines. You see on the genuine article on the right, I think those are Grovers. They're round beans, whereas on the Chinese, they're squared with a round top, but not the same. You can see them side by side. They're very different tuning pegs. Okay, let's look at the mother of pearl diamond inlay. If you look at the genuine article, it's much bigger and much cleaner, and everything is square. So if you look at it, things don't line up on the Chinese version. The rectangle isn't square. The corners aren't right angled, particularly on the left side. You'll notice that the gap between the rectangle and the top two triangles, there's a bigger gap on the left side than on the right. But on the Gibson, you see it is clean and consistent all the way through. So very, very clear there as well. Now, if we go to the truss rod cover, you can see the word custom looks a little blurry on the fake, and on the genuine article, it's very crisp, as is the word Les Paul, right? The name Les Paul. You can see Les Paul on the Chinese Gibson is just kind of right, but not quite. Now, let's look at the nut. The nut on the Chinese guitar is white, and it's chunky, it's big. You look at the nut on the actual Gibson, it's ivory looking, and it's clean and much smaller, okay? So pay attention to what you're seeing when you're looking at a Les Paul to determine that it is not from China. One of the biggest tells, if you look at this, is the distance between the open book and the first set of peg heads tuners. It's huge, whereas on the Gibson, the real Gibson, it's not very far at all. In this image, you see on the left a Gibson. On the right, you see a genuine Les Paul. Now, right away, you can see the horn is really weird looking on the Chinese Gibson. And as you can see on the genuine article, that's the way a Les Paul horn is supposed to look, because that's a genuine Les Paul, right? Now, while the wood on the Chinese Gibson, the flame top, may look real pretty, don't let that be a distraction. Look at the things that you need to look at. The other thing is, you'll notice, for the most part, the binding is also ivory cream on the real deal. On the fake Gibson, on the left, you see it's white. And so part of how that works is you've got to remember they're probably also spraying the Gibson, or the fake Gibsons, with a polyurethane coating, not a nitrocellulose coating as on the genuine article. Further, look at the pickup ring. You'll notice on the thin part that straddles left to right on the top and the bottom of the pickup ring, on the Chinese Gibson, it's kind of thick. Whereas if you look at it on the genuine article, it's much thinner. And also, when you look at the sides, the vertical parts where the adjustment screws are, it too is also really pretty thick. And you look on the real deal, it's not quite so thick. Now, this is a very small and minor detail, but the devil is in the details, as they say. And you can look at the pickup too. In the Chinese Gibson, I don't know what that is, but it's got these huge screws or whatever those are. And the bobbin is white, not cream. So there's another giveaway. And well, on the genuine Gibson, we don't see the bobbins. We just have a pickup cover, which generally is nickel plated. Okay, so just kind of look at that and you see the differences are kind of stark if you just take a half a second to really look at it. And we can look at the inlays on the fretboard too. The consistency and the square, meaning that it's squared to the frets, parallel to the frets, properly parallel, is right on the money. If you look at the Chinese Gibson, you can see the top inlay is a little off, and that's important. Another thing is they call them nibs on the fret ends. You'll notice the frets on the Chinese Gibson go all the way to the edge of the binding on the neck, whereas the genuine Gibson, the frets go only to the edge of the rosewood, and the binding has little nibs that take up the extra slack to the edge of the width. You also notice the frets. I'm assuming the one on the right, the Gibson on the right, is a reissue of a Les Paul or a 60s or 50s model because it has fairly narrow frets. So this one isn't quite the best tell, but you notice the frets on the Chinese Gibson look like they're 6105s. And then the narrower vintage frets on the actual Gibson, I don't remember what the designation is on those, but they are vintage narrow, whereas on the Chinese Gibson on the left, not vintage narrow. Not that that's a big deal, but just a further thing if you're looking at something as a 50s or 60s model or a reissue of a late 50s model, you're going to have certain appointments that are important to know. The vintage frets would be on the vintage leaning, not the more modern Les Paul. Okay, so the frets are probably the least of your worries in this particular case. This next example is a really big tell. Number one, if I use belly button reference, the Gibson is an innie and the Gibson is an outie. Okay, so for the Gibson, it goes under the nut. You have to insert an Allen wrench under the, into the thing under the nut to adjust the truss rod. On the Gibson, you actually will use a hex style adjustment tool that goes on the outside of that extruded brass part, the extended brass part, because it's a hex thing on there. So you're actually adjusting it, going around the outside of it, not putting an Allen wrench on the inside. So that's a big one. Also, just as an aside, you'll notice on the Gibson, there's 2 screw holes on either side of the adjustment for the truss rod. That there too is another tell. Gibson doesn't do that. While Epiphone does, Gibson does not. Okay, so there's another tell for a fake Gibson. You've got 3 screws on your truss rod cover. Just wanted to point that out as a secondary thing. And you can see in the Gibson, the truss rod cover screw is behind the truss rod adjustment. So you've only got 2 screws. Again, you look at the nut, it's huge on the Gibson, not so huge on the Gibson. So this is an easy way to tell if it's a real Gibson or not. Another way to tell is to look at the control pocket. On the left is the Gibson, and you can see the capacitors, the little round kind of tannish sienna looking thing. You can barely see it under the big black wire. That's not what Gibson uses. Gibson uses, quote, bumblebee style capacitors. You'll notice the wires are really thin. You'll notice the wires coming out of the square hole on the left are from the pickups. They're not covered in braided shielding. They are just covered in plastic, and the shielding is underneath that plastic sleeve. You'll also notice the pots themselves. On the Gibson, you can see the Gibson logo. On the Chinese, there is no Gibson logo because these are not Gibson guitars, right? And the grounding wire between all of them is much thinner than on the Gibson. Not a big deal there, but it's nonetheless the point being made there. And you'll see the soldered points are actually a little cleaner on the Gibson than they are on the fake Gibson. Okay. Earlier, I mentioned the nibs on the side of the binding on the neck. Here, you can see on the Chinese guitar on the left, the frets go all the way to the edge of the binding. On the right, you see an actual Gibson where the fret stops at the edge of the actual wood of the fretboard, and you have the binding rises up to meet the fret, and that's called a nib, that it continues to the edge of the binding. So just to give you a little bit more detail on that particular issue, just to further reinforce that a brand new Gibson will not have frets to the edge of the binding. Now, that said, not to further confuse, once you start refretting guitars, those nibs, I don't care. I put the fret all the way to the edge of the binding. It's not that big a deal to me. I do it on all of my guitars because it's just so much work for a luthier to do that thing to keep the nibs in place, because then he's got to file the frets down to match the nibs, and it's just a pain. But on a brand new Gibson, those nibs will be there. And if the guitar has never been refretted, those nibs will be there, absolutely. Whereas on the Gibson, no nibs, fret goes all the way to the edge of the binding. All right, one last detail. It's kind of important because it's a pretty quick tell, right? And that is the imprint of the serial number on the back of the peg head. When Gibson imprints the serial number and the Made in the USA logo, they're very soft feeling, like they just kind of slowly squeezed it into the wood. And so that gives soft edges. The Chinese counterfeits are very hard-edged, like they had very slammed it in there very quickly to make sure that it imprints and it's very crisp and clean, right? Gibson, not crisp and clean, kind of soft and rounded edges. Counterfeit, hard edges, crisp and clean. So it's a really easy tell. Plus, you can use an app to go and find out if your serial number is legitimate or not. Sometimes it may show up as legitimate, but the other tells that we've talked about will show you that it is or is not, right? And so you really want to be aware of these things. Now, where the Gretsch and the PRS and the Fender guitars are concerned, I don't have the information at hand right now, but when I do get enough information to share about how to spot fake Gretsch's, PRS, and Fenders, I will create a Geoff Talk for those as well. All right. I hope this has been informative of you, particularly regarding Les Pauls, since that's what I focused on. Customs doesn't always get everything. Stuff gets through and it gets into the marketplace. And if people are buying stuff from overseas and it's being shipped to the US as a genuine article, they're buying it thinking it's the real deal. That's another way instruments get into this country or your country undetected by customs. So it's good to be aware of things and to be on top of knowing what to look for to guarantee that you are looking at the genuine article or a counterfeit so that you can walk away. Okay, Thank you once again for taking the time to listen to me rattle on about stuff that I think is important and hope that you find important as well. So until next time, you take care and we'll see you there.